Coming up next on The Health Hustle.
One of the things that ended up happening when it was at that lowest point and all these things aren't working, and just even from talk about a disempowered state, it's like the thing that you would think is available to all of us. I'd look in at be in an airport and see kids sleeping, old people sleeping, young people sleeping. It's like available to everyone, and yet it feels as if I cannot have a say over this thing, this very primal thing of being able to know yourself to get sleep night after night. So it felt very disempowered and just like total failure. And so what ended up coming out of this was this fire to that, at the time it was to fix and get rid of this problem. But it ended up actually being this kind of quest to understand more about what it would take to get great sleep over the long term. So I tried lots of things and I spent lots of money and I worked with lots of doctors and lots of practitioners, and some things worked, some things didn't. What shook out though out of all of it was this kind of relationship to circadian health and how that could be the guiding force to transforming not only sleep, but that balance to life.
Hey folks, and welcome to the Health Hustle of Austin, Texas. On this show, we uncover the big ideas from your fellow health and fitness entrepreneurs in the Austin, Texas area about how they built their business and the lessons they learned along the way. What's up, y'all? Corey here, and on this episode, I had a chance to sit down with Mollie Eastman of Sleep is a Skill. And let me tell you, Mollie's depth of knowledge about the topic of sleep is honestly incredible. At certain points of this conversation, I let Mollie run with it because I was so fascinated by how profoundly sleep affects every area of our life. Not to mention that Mollie is just a great speaker since she hosts her own podcast show as well called Sleep is a Skill, which I highly recommend everybody checks out. And she also has an ongoing newsletter that's pretty wonderful as well, just about the topics of sleep. Some of the things that we get into on this episode are where she gets her entrepreneurship drive, how her upbringing taught her how to read body language, why you should make peace with your past, the importance of meal timing, how sleep impacts every area of your life, what it means to live a polymath life, Mollie's rock bottom moment, how she was able to get her health back, the power of circadian rhythm, building up your sleep capital, biophilia, which that was an interesting topic, a rapid fire question round, and so much more. One last thing, if you're a health or fitness professional and you're having difficulties getting leads, one of the most common reasons that I see this is not having a well-defined niche. If you go to the link in the description, I have a free 3-step process that walks you through exactly how to get clarity on which niche is best suited for you and your business. Without further ado, let's go. Mollie Eastman, welcome to the show. How you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me. 99, we think.
Yeah.
Ish.
Yeah.
90 something.
High 90s.
High 90s.
Why do keyboards never sleep?
Did you just Google a quick joke? I don't know why.
Because they have 2 shifts.
What career did the spider take on?
What?
Web designer.
That is so fitting for me.
That's so good, right?
That's what I do. That's great. Well done. Wow. Did you?
I don't know. I just had to come up with something.
That?
That's one of my favorite jokes of all time. I think I'm actually butchering it. There's some sort of like cute thing with it. But I love that one.
All right, Mollie Eastman. So at some point in this conversation, you're going to convince me to stop eating so much food late at night because it's definitely messy with my sleep.
I love this topic.
And just to give Mollie a little background, she's essentially a sleep expert. But before we get into the sleep stuff, we're going to just tap into more or less you and your story and your journey. And I want to start grassroots with you of growing up in Maine. Can we talk about that?
Yes, we can.
Tell me what that experience was like and what you learned from growing up in middle of nowhere, Maine.
Middle of nowhere, Maine. All we have really noteworthy. I don't mean to totally just diminish what we have going on in Maine, but one of the most noteworthy things going on in Maine is Stephen King. That's a very popular piece, lobsters. And yet, what else do you think of when you think of Maine? It's kind of like woods, peaceful, etc. Well, I grew up in inland Maine, northern Maine. Miles between each house, and grew up with very little money. Grew up in a trailer, a lot of shame around my lack of, just financial aptitude, right? So grew up on welfare, just eating ramen, Kraft mac and cheese, the whole thing. And a lot of, I think, that entrepreneurial drive came from this, I'm not okay. Like, it's not acceptable where I'm at, or like it's shameful, or I've got to change it or fix or change, or there's something like bad or wrong about where I'm at. So I do think a lot of that drive came from that place. Is that a healthy place to come from? Questionable. But the beginning piece, I think, was from a area of discontent with my original lot in life.
Yeah, I've heard it said that a huge predictor of future success is actually based on area code, which is fascinating for somebody, because like I think you see two things in people who grow up in that sort of environment, is that it crushes them,
Yeah.
and they don't really do much, or it does the opposite and it propels them and it skyrockets them to where they want to go in their life. Because you are, as I would say, ambitious as hell from all the entrepreneurship that you've done, and so it's interesting that you were able to take that lesson away from it. Do you have any idea as to why that would be?
Yeah, that's interesting. I think there was a real, so one, I love what you said about the zip code piece. I think that's a super interesting area of study. I talk a lot about that from a health geography perspective. We were chatting about that before recording. So I do think it's so important to look at our environment critically and consider what might yield some of the particular results. And to your point, maybe aspirations could be one of those things. So yes, I think that at least in my case, what I saw was there's a lot of fear for me of going down the path of certain things that I saw. There was a lot of alcoholism. There was a lot of kind of financially destitute, kind of pathways that a lot of people I saw were on. Where I grew up, actually, there was a high rate of illiteracy rates were high, just not a particularly kind of rich look or curiosity in the world around you. It's kind of a lack of possibility. And I think a lot of that was a fearful destination for me. So it felt like I got to get myself to a new location was kind of the goal, not really knowing what that would look like, honestly, but just like I got to get to somewhere new and up level in a particular way, but having no real idea what that would look like.
Do you have siblings?
No, only child. So a lot of thinking was happening from the neck up.
Yeah.
You can tell. Yeah.
Do you have any idea, this is a tough question and I realize that, as to why you chose entrepreneurship as the vehicle versus like any other vehicle, right? Because it could have been go get a corporate job or go work for Amazon or Google or whatever. Like why entrepreneurship?
Yeah, it is an interesting question. And, maybe I'm still kind of discovering that for myself. But I think there's a lot of appeal because I tend to be someone, and you might hear this in this conversation, that can get pretty obsessive about certain things. And certainly, foreshadowing that happened with sleep. And I'm still very much obsessed with sleep every single day. So fascinated by this thing that we do. And yet that obsession, I think, is really nicely suited for entrepreneurship, maybe for better or for worse. You got to be careful and check yourself with all these things. You could make, of course, the argument that could be fantastic in certain lines of business, obviously. And I do think there's a bit of one thing that I've always valued is being outside of the bell curve, being kind of, taking the path less traveled. And I think entrepreneurs really embody a lot of that.
Totally. That makes a lot of sense. And
yeah.
we're glad that you did. So
thank you. Right back at you.
For sure. So let's follow this journey a little bit then. So you were in Maine, grew up, decided eventually to get out and leave and go to New York. What was the catalyst there?
So I guess what I would say is I applied to a lot of different colleges, and a lot of them, I wanted some distance between where I had known. So the kind of the birthplace of where I had been grown up, I wanted some distance. So I applied a lot of New York, kind of Connecticut, New Jersey, all around that. It felt like enough of a jump, right? And then I ended up getting into Syracuse, and like I shared, I didn't have any real money. And so thankfully they provided a decent, scholarships and what have you. So that was part of my journey there. They also had a great kind of communications program. And so went in that direction. Also, there was some sort of allure of what you might think of with New York, and granted, Syracuse is a whole different part of New York, but that felt like a step closer to the glittering lights of Manhattan, and New York was kind of my into the knowledge that comes from a teenager. It's kind of how you're making your decisions at the time, but that felt appealing.
Yeah, I know that you studied communications and body language. Have you ever thought as to why you decided to tap into those? Did it have anything to do with the upbringing and like where you grew up?
Yeah, definitely. So one, I had a lot of people in my family that had a lot of mental health issues, and people very close to me in my family were dealt with really very challenging bouts of mental health. So there's bipolar, schizophrenia, all kinds of really, serious mental health issues. And so a lot of what I would spend my time doing was trying to evaluate, are they okay? Are they not okay? And alcoholism was the other piece. So just really checking, is this a safe environment, not a safe environment? So that hypervigilance is part of what I was had felt natural and a place that I'd hung out in a lot. So it lended itself nicely to communications, reading others, reading yourself, and now, is that a healthy place to have all these things come from? Maybe not necessarily, but it did allow me to explore these things.
I'd say one of my skills is just like basic pattern recognition.
Sure.
And so it's interesting how I've seen that more often than not is that people who grow up in more, I guess, emotionally challenging situations
Sure.
tend to gravitate towards that aspect of just understanding human behavior and
Yes.
communication and body language and like just understanding energy levels and like being able to walk into a room and just feel what's happening.
Yeah.
Because like I think you're heightened to other people's emotions and paying attention to that. It sounds like you had a similar experience.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's, now I like to think of it as more of a really important skill set and something that can be utilized and you can really take advantage of, especially in a day and age of screens and TikTok and Instagram and all these things. The more and more divided we are, the less practice a lot of us have in these, kind of real world interpersonal interactions. And so while mine happen to be fueled from kind of maybe a fearful or something's wrong background, it began over time. I like to think that it's morphed more into a curiosity. I've done a lot of personal development, continue to do a lot of that. I have a lot of coaches, and throughout all of that kind of help to find the fun and excitement in kind of bonding with others based around being able to find commonalities and things that can also set other people at ease based on reading of where they might be at. Now, of course, there's a lot of, you can have a whole podcast on reading people and what works, what doesn't work, but I think it's an interesting area.
Do you feel like now, are you still running away from Maine or are you running towards something now? Because I think a lot about that.
That's a great question. So I think there's been more of this happy marriage of Maine, at least in my life. So in Maine, you could put almost in air quotes for anyone listening, they might have their own area that they might have initially spent a lot of their life maybe trying, like you said, trying to get away, run away from, kind of detach from. And now I think I'm embarking on this process of starting to actually make peace with that, which has been really, really amazing. And also, I think it goes along with some of those family members that I was mentioning. They're had some different really rock bottom moments, but also are coming out on the other side and really working through some of those. So now as I've gone back to Maine, there's kind of an opportunity to rebuild new memories and ways of relating to that area and actually really taking advantage of the peace that comes from that area. I think there was something in the seasons of my younger life that was like, this is too slow. I'm going to get stuck in here. It's like a black hole, like all these narratives that I would relate to how I was thinking of that as a needing to get out, need to get to the energy of New York or what have you. And now my whole ethos and a lot of my values and things have shifted over time. And now there's such an appreciation when I go back and it is peaceful and, just calming in nature. And it's a whole new way of relating to it and actually an opportunity to go towards that.
That's good awareness. Do you still use the body language skills that you learned when you were in school?
Yes. So these play out really, really nicely for the things I do, particularly with sleep as a skill, but also just in interactions in business, podcasting. So we basically run these cohorts. And with these cohorts, there's a lot of kind of group dynamics that can go into these. All of those skills around really, it's in the realm of communications and rhetorical studies. And rhetoric is really defined as the art of finding in any given situation the available means of persuasion. And that basically points to how are you, what type of group are you speaking to? What could serve them in that moment, and what would really move the needle for them? And that's particularly important in things like, cohorts or small groups, particularly when you're bringing in really large scale behavioral change, like we maybe will get to when you're trying to change things that you've been doing for years, eating late at night, basic, element that we might know, but it's very challenging to shift some of those behaviors. And I think some of those things can come into play nicely to help support that.
Well, since you brought it up, that is something I'm definitely challenged with right now. And it's purely based in the fact that I just enjoy not eating in the mornings because I'm more focused. I'm sure probably because of a heightened cortisol, if I had to guess. I'm not sure exactly.
Yeah.
So then that forces me to obviously backload a lot of my day. And so I just haven't got out of that routine because I just love the focus in the morning. That's honestly been the challenge.
Yeah, no, I completely hear that. And I will say, so I have been for many, many years, love to explore kind of this N=1. And I encourage, all of our people that we work with at Sleep as a Skill to bring about some of their own experimental air. And so everyone that we do work with has to wear at least the Oura Ring, and not from any particular affiliation, but just a centralized place to track their habits, and in this case, their sleep. And so I say all that because I think it's an opportunity for all of us to learn where we're at as far as particular habits and make a change and experiment. When it comes to meal timing, I spent so many years doing the opposite of what I now do. So it's the opposite of that kind of circadian aligned approach, and we'll likely potentially talk about some of the circadian approach. But if you peel back the layers, intermittent fasting, which it sounds like you're speaking to, for many years, that's been the move. And that's something that I did for a long time: skip breakfast. And then, of course, by virtue, in order to get sufficient, fuel in, you need to backload. Did the same thing. What's exciting, I think, is some of what's coming out in this study of chronobiology, the science of time and how time affects your biology, is what happens when we basically just shift things around and front load a bit more. And you can still enact intermittent fasting. And so it's often put under the umbrella of circadian rhythm intermittent fasting. So it's basically meaning that you're eating within sunrise and sunset. And if you think about hunter-gatherers, that's, the predominant way of human beings, how we would have operated for thousands of years. I mean, this way of eating and living is very, very new, because the majority of our time on this planet has been hunter-gatherer in nature. So what we think is that we likely would have only ate between sunrise and sunset, most likely, because no refrigerators, pantries, all the things, and pitch black post sunset. So the ability to go hunting and gathering is unlikely to happen. So most people are getting most of their calories in on that earlier side. So from a kind of Darwinian perspective, have we evolved to now warrant the flip side of what we've been doing, and basically eating much, much later into the evening while it's dark out? If we peel back the layers, all of us are diurnal creatures, meaning we're meant to be active by day and at rest at night. And if we deviate from that, we know that the World Health Organization listed doing exactly that, deviating from active by day and at rest at night, so basically shift workers, and being active in the evening, maybe potentially eating in the evening and all the things that you might do if you're active in the evening, as a possible carcinogen, class 2A possible carcinogen. So there seems to be really real world health and well-being effects when we deviate from this too greatly. So it's something to kind of explore. We can unpack it.
So you're telling me I'm going to die if I don't fix my eating schedule is what you're telling me.
Coming in hot here with the doom and gloom, aren't I?
I heard carcinogens and circadian rhythms, and you're fucked, is what I heard. Basically.
Oh my God. So funny. My husband Blake he will often say, you need to start a series called Mollie Ruins Everything. And it's just an ongoing saga of you can't do this, you can do this. So I hope I don't leave people with that. Instead, what I'd love to share is an opportunity to instead be informed by our environment. That's really, and I've been kind of working on this is like a happening in real time workshopping on how to really explain one of the reasons why I find this so exciting, this kind of circadian biology approach. And I keep saying circadian, so I should probably define circadian. In case anyone doesn't know, our circadian rhythm is basically this 24-hour rhythm, kind of biological rhythms that our body is functioning on. It's Latin, circa a day is what it kind of breaks down to. So a little over 24 hours. And this process that we just happen over and over again, this 24-hour kind of cycle. And so one of the reasons why I think it's so empowering, especially bringing it back to entrepreneurs, is that many entrepreneurs, I don't mean to speak for everyone because maybe some people have really great honed in structures, but a lot of entrepreneurs, especially the ones I work with, have the blessing and the curse of making their own hours. And this can kind of be problematic. Because certainly one of the things that happened for me was with that freedom, sleep loves consistency. And so when you start having those things at odds, the ability to sleep in whenever you want, if you choose, and you start deviating from all of your behaviors and all the obligations and maybe potential stress load and working at odd hours and feeling that responsibility that a lot of entrepreneurs feel, a lot of that, it could support us to be informed by our environment of what to be doing when. And that's one of the things that I think is really, really beneficial. I've joked that it's almost like being like the Amish, and the Amish they'll know they've got a certain period of time before sun sets. So it's like the ultimate productivity hack. Okay, we've got to do all the things before sun sets. Now, I'm not saying that everyone needs to be Amish, and fantastic as far as what Amish people are doing. What I'm saying is instead, it's hearkening back to days past, and how could we really look at activating tasks and putting them on the front half of our day and putting down regulation tasks on the back half of our day. And when we think of down regulation tasks, we have an idea that of some of our understanding of how, from an anthropological perspective, how people likely behaved in the past was that the evenings were more for that down regulation. So that would more be the time of maybe connection, music, drawing, dancing, just all of that kind of greater, kind of topics that you could explore, but just from a kind of calming perspective in a dimly lit environment. That was just sort of how our best understanding of how things went. And I'm greatly oversimplifying, of course, but how can we pull some of this into our modern society in a day and age when we've got brightly lit screens at all angles? We've just got a lot of possibilities and opportunity to be on at all days and night. I mean, I lived in Manhattan. You could do whatever you want 24 hours a day. I lived in Vegas. You can do whatever you want 24 hours a day. Just some of the craziest places in the world. And I saw some of the impacts of that when you live a life when you couldn't even be told, you couldn't even share what time sunrise is, what time sunset is, because why even care about that? Because you're not even needing to be connected to that. So it's an opportunity to pause, bring it back, and kind of see how can we live a bit more in alignment with the rhythms of nature.
Yeah, I've not used that language of like up-regulating, down-regulating.
Sure.
But I've often heard it talked about just the aspect of more focused, logical tasks earlier in the day versus more like creative, expressive tasks later in the day. Feels like a very similar concept to what you're talking about. But
100%. Yeah. We just had on our podcast, I'm very excited. I think it was like an accident that this guest wandered onto our podcast, is Dr. Sachin Panda, and like literally being tapped as possible Nobel Prize winning research in the area of circadian health. He's the meal timing guy, essentially.
So he's also going to tell me I'm going to die. Is what you're telling me. Okay, got it.
Well,
stop eating so close to bed.
He's
You're going to lose 10 years of your life.
He's got a point to all the benefits that can come about as we start to shift some of this early. Cue the eye roll. Listen, and
if anyone's watching, I rolled the shit out of my eyes.
Liz, I know. And it's been one of the crazier behavioral changes that I've made. I've shared to a lot of people. Just about everyone that knows me knows that I love popcorn of all things. Popcorn is like my go-to. It's some sort of weird meditation. It's like I could zone out, and it's some sort of like I've earned this like right to just, do my
Yeah.
thing. And I would always often do this in the evenings. And then back in the day, before I was connected to any of this around sleep, maybe pair it with a drink, pair it with, THC, pair it with all the things not to do. So I've definitely lived exactly that life that you're speaking to. And so many of my clients do the same thing. So it's not to oversimplify. And I don't think it has to be a black and white thing. But one of the things that I think is really powerful are the ability to bring in wearables where possible, because a lot of that starts gamifying it, because then you start to unequivocally see the difference that happens when you just scoot the last bite of food that you're having in the evening just a little bit earlier. And you'll see often this lowering of heart rate, often improvement in HRV, heart rate variability, which is a big metric. There's an argument that could be one of the more powerful metrics from a consumer grade tracker perspective, because it seems to point to the ability to recover throughout the course of the night. So moment to moment to moment. And so improvements in that metric, improvements in respiratory rate, so kind of lowering of how many breaths per minute we're having to take, in lowering of body temperature, all these things that really reflect nervous system management being improved by something as seemingly innocuous as when did we have our last bite of food?
What? Like 3 hours? Like how many hours are we talking before bed here?
Okay, really good question. So that expert, kind of reigning expert in the field, Dr. Sachin Panda, points to at least 2 to 3 hours as your last bite of food. Now, so I think that's a really exciting place to begin. There are certain studies, smaller studies, but I'm really curious to see more of these where some of these participants are ending their last bite of food even earlier than that. So 4 to 5 hours, sometimes longer. And what I've seen from anecdotally, now this is anecdotally, but we do have hundreds of people on our Oura Ring dashboard. So we have one of the larger Oura Ring dashboard groupings from a sleep optimization perspective outside of research. So get to see a lot of people and how their, behavioral changes are impacting their sleep. I've seen some really cool things when people just experiment with pulling that last bite of food a little bit earlier than they might anticipate, and putting it just in alignment with what we were talking about, circadian rhythm, intermittent fasting. Essentially, that's how can you eat largely within sunrise and sunset. There's apps that can help you with this. The Dr. Sachin Panda one is called On Time Health. There's some other ones that get even more nuanced from a circadian perspective. So circadian life is one that will even talk, you put in kind of geotagging where you are. So it will align with when sunset is, but also when you should be lowering your lights in your environment, when you should be getting bright light exposure in the day, and including this meal timing piece. Because, we're talking about meal timing, and why are we talking about meal timing as it relates to sleep? This is known as a Zeitgeber, which is German for time giver. So these time givers that affect the strength of our circadian rhythm. So it's just one. There's a bunch. The most powerful by far is our light-dark cycle. So we know that one is so crucial, I think underestimated and maybe oversimplified, because it might sound like, oh, okay, just get bright light, get, make it a little dim. That's about it. It's much more nuanced than that. It kind of goes into kind of the physics of light. But certainly that's a top Zeitgeber. Temperature is another top Zeitgeber. But what are some of the things that affect temperature? Certainly meal timing is going to affect your bodily temperature. And then things like movement. So are you working out or you're not working out, and what times? Also, if you go into, there's other Zeitgebers that get a little bit more nuanced. So things like your social cues. So that one's a little more nuanced. Things like thought timing. So the types of thoughts that you're engaging in can actually have a physical effect from a body temperature perspective. So for example, there's a gadget, it was recently bought out, but it was called EBB, and it had clinical trials behind it and showing that looking at groups of people that were chronic insomniacs, and they tended to have warmer prefrontal brain. So in their prefrontal cortex, the brain matter was warmer than participants that could fall asleep more with ease. So it's essentially looking at our thoughts create a real world physiological effect, which is kind of trippy. Goes into health psychology, essentially. But your thoughts creating a physical, measurable effect on your body, which I think is pretty cool, just way to think about and have reverence for the types of thoughts you're having and when. So, I mean, I get in trouble for this all the time from my husband, Blake. I mentioned he was the one that said I should do the why, Mollie ruins everything segment. He'll often have to corral me in. This is by far my weakest area is thought timing, because I'll go into, it's like leading up. I know I should be winding down regulating in the evening. And then even stress is is like excitement stress. So you can go into, this idea for the business and this podcast.
New project, yeah.
Right.
For sure.
And so you want to look at is that kind of the thought timing you want to be engaging in and catch yourself before you go kind of down some of those paths. So, I'm just throwing out a bunch of things that impact sleep, but I hope one of the messages that's kind of left is that there's an opportunity to get curious about the many behaviors that we engage in and how much of a say we have in our sleep results that we might not have even realized.
I can't tell, but I think you like learning about sleep. Just based on the expert level thought processes behind getting a good night's sleep. The one that actually really messed mine up last night, I'm very aware of it, is like it was just way too warm. I woke up.
Temperature, huge.
Yeah, crushed me last night. I slept terrible for that obvious reason. But
have you explored things for temperature regulation, like chili pad, 8 sleep, all of sleep number?
Normally it's just like a thermostat deal. Like I just didn't turn the temperature down enough because I'm staying at a buddy's place and I'm watching his dog right now.
Okay.
And so like his place is just a lot warmer than mine.
Yes.
And so like I just legitimately just didn't turn it down enough because like I'm normally pretty conscious of that stuff of like totally dark, like as quiet as it can be, very cool, all those normal things.
Yeah.
And I generally sleep pretty well. I will say though, like my crux though was by far like the eating too late thing, which has always been. But after this conversation, we'll explore this.
Oh, exciting! Yes. Do you track your sleep at all?
No.
No. Okay. Yeah. You're more intuitive.
Yeah.
I would say, do you wake up at around the same time consistently every morning? Fantastic. If anyone's listening, no matter where you might be at in this kind of journey with your sleep, if anyone's listening, like, my sleep's pretty fine, like, move on to the more important topics or what have you. I hope that we can, catch you and create a level of intrigue and excitement that no matter where you're at with your sleep, that there's things that we can do to up level. I mean, I'm continue to be curious and excited about this area for myself as well, because I get to test all kinds of cool things. I get all kinds of gadgets and things and products to test down, see, do those make a difference with sleep? But a lot of it's really kind of life management and so it's kind of pulls that back. But I share all that because I think for someone like yourself, there's just an opportunity to see from even a productivity perspective. So now I think of it in this way. I think of it that I'm addicted to feeling good because I used to think that it was just destined for me to wake up and feel really not good. For many, many years throughout my growing up and, college, I would just wake up with headaches or just dragging zombie. I would need whatever my latest supplements, stimulants were at the time, different cocktails of things, and just thought that that's how it was for me. And it turns out, at least, so certainly my experience and many people that I've encountered as they start to live more in this kind of circadian aligned lifestyle and all that supports great sleep and health, that you start to actually experience life of waking up feeling really good. And honestly, in a day and age when a majority of people are metabolically unhealthy, that's a big piece of getting great sleep, poor sleep habits in general, poor exercise habits, a lot of these things, they don't wake up necessarily feeling great consistently. So I think as we start to then correlate some of the big needle movers, and meal timing is one of those, then you start to get that linked up and actually want to feel those effects the following day. So I think it can be an evolving process.
Yeah, there's a few things I want to pull from that. One is my buddy Joel Cochran, a recent episode that I had. He's more or less like a nutrition coach, but one of the very first things, 101 that they do is they talk about sleep. Because of the carryover into nutrition. And the other thing I want to pull from that too is you're talking about just like some of the main pillar things. I think I have most of them covered in terms of like I sleep with an eye mask, earplugs if I'm in a noisy environment. Actually, mouth tape has been a regular thing for a long time.
Great.
Cool environment. There's a lot of regular pillars too, I think, that most people could probably pick up pretty easily.
Yeah.
But so I want to come back to you though, and I want to pull back on your journey a little bit. because before we get to how you became obsessed with sleep, which you obviously are now,
Sure.
There was a little bit of a transition phase of you were working in corporate America before you decided to take the leap. Can we tell that story?
Totally. I hope that it can be helpful if anyone listening is embarking on that journey and has entrepreneurial curious and wants to explore this whole world and yet has questions of what direction to go in. That was certainly me. And so what this looked like was I graduated from college, went into the corporate space, had, a job in Manhattan. It was all the things that I thought was part of the goal, and had assistants and was traveling and all that. And yet was miserable, felt like I had just, each day that was going by was like I was getting further and further away from a particular direction that I didn't know what this direction was, but I knew it was going in the other direction that I needed to be going. So there was that drive to to venture into entrepreneurship, but how and which direction? So I had a lot of questions, and yet what I ended up doing was going and taking many, many different classes that were of interest to me that seemed to just like light me up or be noteworthy that I wanted to explore. Thankfully, I was in New York, so that did lend itself to giving lots of access to lots of different types of topics. And I do think the internet can certainly serve that purpose if the actual proximity is not there for people.
What kind of classes were you talking about?
I took a ton. I took a lot of communication leaning ones that lended itself nicely given my background. And that's where I ended up doing some of the body language and nonverbal communication courses throughout New York. But there was also other ones that might be more kind of artistic in nature. So more drawing, improvs, kind of like public speaking, voice, there was periods when I was taking everything, and terrarium classes, whatever,
Terrarium?
That was one of it. That was maybe not advisable.
What is that?
But you're making terrarium. Do you ever seen a terrarium?
No.
Okay. So this is not probably advisable on your entrepreneurial journey, but this is essentially like how you make, just kindergartening essentially, right? But the takeaway from that can be you're taking just about everything. And one of the reasons that I pull from this, Steve Jobs did a great job of speaking to one of these things where you never quite realize where some of these things can all connect. So he had a great example of calligraphy. So he was going to, during his college career, I think he was like auditing all these different courses. And one of the things that I hope I'm not butchering the story, but my takeaway is that he took a calligraphy class, had no practical application for his life or any of the other things that he was venturing in on. And yet it ended up serving, he liked it. He had enjoyment. It gave him joy. So it was a direction he went. Later, it actually became a defining piece on the initiation of the Mac, because one of the things that stood out about Mac versus PC that was very more, robotic and kind of sterile was Mac had all these cool font options. And part of that came from his odd background in the interest and intrigue in different scripts, essentially. So I think that there's something to pull out. Now, terrarium, maybe don't take that class, but but you could take and just get yourself immersed in things that are of interest to you, and just start to pluck that passion and that joy and excitement that comes from those things. And also notice the things that aren't exciting you. I definitely took other classes that were like, I'd rather not. So pulling from those things and pulling those all together. Now, the body language piece, the nonverbal communication piece really stuck. And so that's part of the direction that I ended up venturing into. And but I would say that there's just this opportunity to get yourself in environments where you get excited. And that was actually how I met my husband, was in one of a class related to nonverbal communication. And so from a dating perspective, I speak with a lot of people on, the frustrations of dating apps and what have you. This is one approach or strategy by which you can be around other people that might just be as lit up about certain things that you are.
I've become fascinated with just the aspect of the snowball effect of learning, though.
Yes.
Is how when you are open to exploring all these new areas and you start to tie them together, how you actually have a capacity to learn things better, even in your own craft or the things that you're interested in. Is like they just start to overlap on top of each other, and it like snowballs into this thing. Like imagine a snowball like going down a mountain, like it's going to get bigger, 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 bigger as it goes.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's how learning is in a lot of ways.
Absolutely. Yeah. This can kind of be this accumulation compounding effect that
Totally.
can come about 100%.
Totally. So, okay, you did all these classes. You've tried a lot of things, which is the best way to figure out how you like to do anything, because we're terrible at knowing what we like, but we're really good at knowing what we don't like, which comes from trying a lot of stuff. What did you find, and what made you decide to eventually do the entrepreneurship thing then?
Yeah, so I ended up really connecting with the nonverbal group. So this is a company in New York City, and that's now my now husband. So he's part of the nonverbal group, the founder of the nonverbal group. So we ended up joining forces, and so that was part of my background, was through Syracuse, communications and rhetorical studies, bringing that into the nonverbal group. And then it allowed me a fantastic place to kind of practice what I was discovering from this entrepreneurial venture. And online course building was one of the things that came out of that as a kind of marketable skill that ended up threading through, kind of a la the Steve Jobs piece. I didn't necessarily know how that would come together, but now comes together nicely with Sleep as a Skill and kind of that behavioral change piece. But I would never have known that that would have been part of the story.
How did you get pulled into all the other ventures then? Because I know you at this point were kind of becoming a serial entrepreneur and like dabbling in a whole bunch of things.
Totally.
Was it just like a hunger to try a bunch of stuff still, or like how did you get pulled into it?
So I will say that there's been a couple people that have been really of interest to me, and one of them was Tim Ferriss, who ended up, I'd read his books years and years prior, and ended up really being curious about that polymath kind of approach to life and this testing out different things. So I was juggling a lot of things at the time. So working at Nonverbal Group, started something called Lecture Loft. So it was using our loft space in New York to have live events coming through. So that was a really cool way to see what that would look like to kind of choreograph and be responsible for groups of people and kind of the group dynamic piece. And then also looked at creating apps. So again, this is in the serial entrepreneur element. I shared with you before we started recording that one of the most consistent things that I've ever done my whole life was for 2,500 days in a row, sending gratitude emails to friends and family, and just, the streak effect every single day, never miss a day. And out of that process, but it was clear that part of that consistency came through accountability, knowing that these people were on this list, and if I just stopped one day, it would be like, well, what happened to that girl? So essentially, it kept it going from that accountability aspect. So I was venturing into looking at creating an app to bring about kind of that group dynamic to gratitude and what could be pulled from that. I was really curious about the piece that gratitude seems to be kind of a contagion effect and have a stickiness to it, that when you see someone publicly share about something, you kind of feel some of that, your tendency to feel some of that too, and then it might lead to kind of a mirroring effect. And so what kind of domino effects, talk about a snowball, could come about from that. So that was an area that I was exploring, and I was lacking some of the skill sets from a seasoned entrepreneur to really juggle all these things effectively. And that's where kind of my future rock bottom moment came, when sleep just kind of went out the window.
Why did you stop at 2,500 gratitude emails?
Yeah, really good question. One of the things, and that was actually a good year and a half ago, 2 years ago or so, when I stopped then and intentionally stopped at 2,500, because I did see, so it felt like a chapter complete, essentially, because one of the things that I was finding for myself, and I do think that this is important with something like gratitude, is really shaking it up a bit, because I did find that I was starting to go through the motions.
Totally agree.
Right?
Yep.
And so it was an opportunity to really explore, all right, how could I do this newly or look at it through a new lens? And I really got value from that practice, and I felt like it had served its purpose.
I could not have said it better myself. And that's why I was curious, because I have found the same thing. I would say my greatest strength is consistency by far.
Yeah, I can see that. Yeah, totally.
And so to be able to do a journaling every day or a gratitude every day or whatever, name your anything every day, I can do that.
Sure.
But at some point it does lose its oomph, right?
Totally.
It stops like actually providing value and it just becomes a rote routine that's just like going through the motions and just doing it for the sake of doing it to like check the box.
Yes.
As opposed to actually getting something out of it. I will say though, as of maybe a year or two ago, I learned something that's called, what is the expression? Homework for life. And basically what that means is that I still do a style of gratitude journal, but basically it's 3 unique things that were about that day that are different than any other day.
Ooh, love that.
And so it forces my brain to constantly be looking for the new things. Because what happens is you always like, I'm grateful for my family and my health and a great night's sleep and whatever it is. And it's just like the same crap.
Yeah.
And it loses a lot of its value. But trying to find new things, I've yet to lose the oomph for this. So
I love that. That's the thing. And that was what I was kind of curious about. So I'm so glad you shared that because I've just been playing with different things. So then I moved over to like sending postcards. I did text messages, just mixing it up more. And I feel like it kind of enacted it newly, my different parts of the brain that were not being tapped into is sort of like, okay, grateful for.
Yeah, I know the feeling.
Yeah. So I love that. That's really very cool.
Okay. Well, awesome. So at this point, then you were doing way too much. Side note on Tim Ferriss too. He was actually at South by. I watched a panel with him. Were you at South by this year?
I was, but briefly.
Okay. Did
so
you
I was
see
only
Tim?
there. I didn't. No, I was there for a friend of mine, just kind of supporting one of her talks. And then went to a couple side kind of peripheral things. I was kind of traveling throughout some of it, so I did not see as much of it as I want to.
Well, the reason I bring that up is I wanted to echo kind of something you were talking about in terms of the polymath of Tim Ferriss and doing multiple things. And it was basically like a reverse style podcast where like the guy was interviewing Tim. And one of the things, I don't remember how he posed the question exactly, but it was something along the lines of like, how do you decide like what to do or what to explore, what to try? And his answer essentially was like energy, like the thing that excites him, because energy is the ultimate currency. And so like,
love that.
And I think it's so true, right? Like when you try to force yourself down a path that you shouldn't be on in the first place, you're going to quit because you just you won't have the energy as other people that are excited about it.
Yes.
And so paying attention to that, I think, is really important. I think a lot of people miss that in life, just in general.
So well said. Yeah. And I think that's one of the things that I'm so grateful that life unexpectedly led me to the sleep topic, because one of the things that I love about sleep is that it's so has its tentacles in all areas of life. So just about every area is applicable to and has a role in the game of improving your sleep. So I feel like I can never, ever get bored of this area, and it just brings about excitement and intrigue.
Love that.
Yeah.
So at this point then, dabbling in way too many things, trying to travel the world and do all the things, you eventually hit a breaking point.
Totally.
Let's talk about it. What happened?
So in the lead up, there was a lot of signs that I missed. And could any entrepreneur relate to any of this, where you're just like, you're probably outside looking in, people can see, oh, all right, this is probably not going to go well. But so how some of the signs were, I had a lot of health things at play. I had the beginnings of an ulcer. I had shingles in my 20s. All these things you probably shouldn't be having. I had anxiety that was going up and up and up and up. I had headaches. I had just a mood instability, just a number of things that were pointing to that something in the way I was managing my life was not working. And yet sleep was not one of the factors that I was really considering or looking at.
What was your spouse saying at this point? I mean, obviously he's a super supportive guy, but still.
Yeah. So I will say that this is another piece of really looking at your environment. So we were in an echo chamber of this is normal, where he was also, but one of the reasons he became an entrepreneur was so that he didn't have to wake up in the mornings for with an alarm. So
that's me, actually.
Okay.
I was just telling this girl the other day, I don't ever set alarms.
Yeah.
It's the greatest thing in the world to me. I
Totally.
love it so much. So.
And it sounds like you have struck a balance, or at least my understanding is you're waking up at around a consistent
7 most days.
Healthy, right. Ours looked very different. It was like 10 a.m., 11 a.m., no. So not advisable, right?
The sun's been up for 5 hours.
Right.
Yeah.
This is a total kind of poker lifestyle. So and so background for him, he's a psychology professor at CUNY, background in forensics, professional poker player, kind of a specialist in nonverbal communication. And so that poker lifestyle is one where that's totally normal behavior to be like a vampire, bat person. So in that echo chamber, it was fine. And so just, no kind of resistance. It's important to kind of have guardrails and people that are kind of checks and balances. And we didn't really have that. So kind of running rogue. And those habits kind of kept going on, and we get more and more extreme. And then finally, when we had this kind of new idea to put everything in storage, get a one-way ticket, a la Tim Ferriss style, travel the world, digital nomads, it's going to be amazing. The stress was at an all-time high. I'd been experiencing my first experiences of panic attacks, which I never had before in my whole life. So that was also like, okay, my nervous system's on edge. Then
wait, what did that look like, having a panic attack?
So one of the first ones, I don't know if this is PG or kind of going into it, but this was, I had an edible and just went a whole different direction and felt like, when will this ever end? And this panic attack that just was very, destabilizing.
Like a lot of anxiety, like you just...
Totally.
Okay.
Yeah. And just, it was my first experience of having any sort of real sustained, like a sense of that your body is working against you is kind of what it felt like. And that was leading up to this big, one-way ticket thing, lifestyle. And I think just the amount of lack of groundedness of now, okay, we don't even have a real place that we're living and what's going on. Just a lot of questions in the air and stress load of how are we going to pay for, the employees and all the things. So then we take everything on the road on the heels of that first kind of panic attack. So we got a one-way ticket to Madrid, and we land there. And I'd never, I grew up poor, and never really experienced jet lag or any of that, any of that. So land, experiencing jet lag, not tired at the times that you should be tired, stressed out, thinking, oh my God, maybe we made this major mistake. What are we even doing? And have a panic attack that night when we land. And so from that, it's like, then I couldn't fall asleep. And then it felt like this sort of snowball effect of just about every single night being off kilter. And then I'm doing all the things not to do, which now if I were to go back and speak to that person, it would be like, okay, there's all kinds of strategies you can enact, but I didn't know these things. So I'm sleeping by the day and trying to get any piece of sleep I possibly can to make up for this. And so what ends up happening is just this period of insomnia. Now I start to get actually nervous because now like the sun is setting and I'm like, oh my God, wait, I'm going to have to face another night not sleeping and just actually starting to fear the nights. And then I go down the rabbit hole and there's a whole world of what's known as sleep anxiety, where it's like a group or like a way of identifying or thinking about your sleep as something to be feared and almost like performance anxiety, kind of the same way you give a speech and you're like, oh, I'm not good at giving a speech. Maybe I'll avoid that. People do that with sleep. And then but you're kind of in trouble because then you're needing to do that every single night. It's kind of important. And if you relate to it as being something that you were just not good at, which is certainly a whole line of thinking that we'd want to explore because it's not really grounded in real logic because it's possible everyone could sleep. And yet that was part of the path that I was going down. And so all of this stress load, this period of insomnia, at one of my lowest points, I have a panic attack in Rome, in the Colosseum of all places, so symbolic with the crumbling, thing. And
my gosh. Did you know you were having these panic attacks?
I knew that I was like totally on edge. And part of this is, going back to, I think that this is another piece of entrepreneurship of knowing that what you're doing, that you're on the right path, that you have purpose and passion around what's important to you. I was feeling very kind of like flailing,
sure,
right? And
sure.
Something like the path I'm on is not the correct one for me.
Right.
So even though it was like this low point, like totally my rock bottom moment in my life, I'm actually very grateful for it because it did serve as kind of a course correction and actually fueled, in this case, this actual passion that I feel I can actually give my whole life to in a way that I never would have thought that was available to me. And so throughout that period, what was very fearful is, I think I'd mentioned that's in my family, there's a lot of people that dealt with mental illness and things. So what I was very afraid of is, oh my God, this is the moment. I'm like losing it. Here we go. This is going to be a pathway of like medications and all the things that I'd always feared.
Because you were how old at this point?
So this was in my late 20s, early 30s.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because is it mid-20s where some of the mental health stuff often shows up, right?
Totally.
Okay.
And so in that moment, it was like, oh, great. Is this red flags? And I went to the doctors in Croatia and left with their version of Ambien. And so it was kind of in that moment like, oh God, I need to get on, take this path, get on a path of what's possible to really shift the trajectory that I'm on.
What were the first couple of things that you did to get you back on path of fighting off panic attacks and all the other things you were experiencing?
Gosh. So I will say I took the sleeping pills, begrudgingly, and it was very much like a fight of, as I'm taking those things, it's, just an internal conflict. It's like, I don't want to be taking these, and yet I'm taking these things. So I'm fighting it the whole time. And that did help me get some sleep for that short period. So I will say there's a time and a place from an acute perspective, but certainly not from a long-term perspective. And unfortunately, we see many people go down that path. Now, I don't mean to give medical advice or anything, but it's something to really be thoughtful about. So
you probably have you ever seen that study where that guy lives underground for like 60 days or 90 days or something like that?
Yes.
You know what I'm talking about?
So the one where it's looking at understanding circadian rhythm and kind of the light dark cycle. Yes. Very important.
That study was so interesting to me and so fascinating. Like only from the aspect of like, I feel like what I took away from it is that every cell of our body is on this 24-hour circadian rhythm cycle.
Yes.
And if you start messing with that, like that's not a good thing, essentially, is what I took away from it.
Exactly. And that's so well said. And even in 2017, the Nobel Prize went to 3 guys who basically started to peel back the layers on the power of our circadian clocks and how they interact, and understanding just a bit more of how pervasive these clocks are in our body. Meaning that there's this master clock that some people might have heard of, the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which is in your brain directly connected to your eyes. It's partly why the light dark cycle is so important, but that's like the choreographer of these clocks. But it's communicating to trillions of clocks that are in every cell and organ in our body, looking to stay on time, craving consistency, craving us to kind of guide some of our behaviors, as well as the environment to guide our behaviors. And, all the things that I shared that didn't work about my behaviors were confusing these clocks to no end. And certainly one of the things that we find, like I just had this expert on the podcast who did really cool work, and this just recently came out, which he's coining the mind after midnight, and exploring one of the characteristics of what happens to our cognition and our thinking process post the proverbial midnight, basically in the evenings, late night. And what they would find is major upticks in anxiety, depression, suicidality, really very real things that would come about just by being awake at these times when we are not meant to be awake. So this is getting a lot of press because I hope that one of the takeaways, just a practical takeaway, could be hopefully to almost create a sense of a framework by which you listen to the thoughts in your mind that are happening in those late night hours. Meaning, if you're having difficulty falling asleep, you wake up in the middle of the night, 3 a.m., 4 a.m., and often these can be the times where the thoughts that you're thinking are just very different than the daytime thoughts. And if you have this framework of knowing that these type of thoughts have a particular flavor to them and can skew stress related, like a sympathetic nervous system-esque response, then hopefully it can help us to maybe not listen to some of these thoughts as much as we might if we didn't know that this was a tendency from our bodies.
So I gotta ask, how strict are you on your sleep, and do you ever stay up past midnight?
Good questions. Okay. So I love all these. So one, a couple of things that came out. I will say sleep disruption and so insomnia, people that really struggle with sleep difficulty, falling asleep, staying asleep, or early awakenings. It's kind of the grouping of insomnia. A lot of these people tend to skew in the perfectionist category of things. And, this is a blanket statement, but it's enough that it seems to be a characteristic of that group. And certainly I was one of those people and can still skew in that direction. So one of the things that I find important, both for myself and for the people that I work with, is also not getting too crazy and too neurotic with some of these things. So knowing that there's going to be times when you're going to skew off of some of your schedule a little bit, or sometimes you're going to, mindfully intentionally choose to stay up a little bit later. It's a friend's wedding. It's an important whatever. You just want to be spontaneous. Those things are going to happen every so often, and not like lose it when that occurs. And having said that, how can we create sort of a sleep capital? And this is pulling from verbiage from an anthropologist we had on the podcast, where the majority of the time you are investing in your sleep capital. And most of the time you're going to bed pretty consistently. I will say when I moved to Austin, I skewed later to facilitate what this anthropologist called social capital. So the massive importance of being socially connected. You're a great example of this, like bringing people together and just how important, especially in a disconnected world. I mean, this is like soul filling, and we have studies to back this up of how important this is. And actually, you can make an argument that impacts your sleep results, because if you do feel disconnected from your tribe, that's like dangerous from a kind of anthropological perspective. So still being able to invest in your social capital. So when I moved here, I skewed later than I had before. It's around about 10:45, 11 p.m. So that's not particularly early. And I really align with the rhythms of nature for the most part, so that I'm waking up with the sun is what I like to kind of facilitate. Now, that gets me kind of frustrated on my area of daylight savings time, and that's a frustrating piece, and really looking forward to abolishing that practice because it takes us outside of these rhythms. And yet that's the kind of shakedown of what my consistent schedule looks like. Is I do have the capabilities to align as much as possible with the rhythms of nature. So that's what I tend to do. I also understand that a lot of people have certain considerations and can't necessarily do that. So even when you can't do that, how can we design a schedule for ourselves that aligns as much as possible and facilitates that bright day, dim night is really what we're looking to create.
I'm glad you brought that up. The idea of just the emotional bank account is what I often call it, or like the capital is the word that you use. But I think about it from the aspect of your health, your relationships, your sleep. Like those are all things that's like if you stock enough things into there, that the moments that when times happen, life happens, challenging situations happen, you have enough stocked up that it's not that big of an issue. I think about that all the time, especially for sleep too, is like if I have a few nights where I don't sleep that well, I don't worry about it anymore because I know I'm pretty good for the most part. I can handle a few days and be okay because I've stocked enough in the bank knowing that I'm pretty good in that realm. So
exactly. You literally, in your verbiage, we had a sleep coach for the Olympics on the podcast, which he brought a really cool way and language to this topic, and he would call it sleep banking. And so if you're banking your sleep, this can be particularly important for athletes, or if you have like a big speech coming up or something that can kind of incite this anticipatory anxiety. You've got just something big on the calendar. And it's very common when that happens that in the lead up, you start having kind of disrupted sleep, difficulty falling asleep. You have more kind of funky dreams. You're waking up more often, maybe early morning awakenings, just dealing with that anxiety. Certainly, if you think about the Olympics, I mean, this is like the moment that people have been waiting for. So we can almost anticipate that they're likely to have some disrupted sleep. So in the prep for that, the thinking is sleep banking, that you're doing everything possible. The meal timing you're dialed in on. You're maybe abstaining from the extra glass of wine, or, there's certain things that you're enacting so that you can support banking a series of nights of great sleep. So then when that likely disruption comes about, you're doing okay.
Love that.
Yeah.
So what's the future of Mollie Eastman look like? You've become obsessed with sleep
Clearly.
and all things associated with it, because it does cover basically every area of our life in so
Yeah.
many ways. And so where do you see things moving forward with everything you're doing with sleep as a skill?
Yeah, I love that. So a couple things that I see. One, I'm excited to bring about this circadian component to it. And, I think people hear the circadian health, circadian lifestyle, and it might land as, oh, well, that's pretty easily understood. But I think when you peel back the layers, there's a lot of things that might be just sort of counterintuitive or not, that we might not be aware of, that can help support a strong circadian cycle. So bringing up more of that clear lifestyle component. So have additional courses, mini classes. Book is one of the processes or that I'm kind of enacting. And what else do we have? Oh, aligning and bringing about circadian biology as it relates to your environment. So what does that look like? Building biology and how you can be aware of your environment impacting your sleep results. So there's a study out of the EPA in 2001 that found that the average person in America was spending around 93% of their time indoors. That's problematic from a sleep perspective because that's divorcing us from those rhythms of nature. We're in a kind of climate-controlled environment, lighting-controlled environment, and you're divorcing yourself from those cues that we would have had in the past that the body is looking for to understand what it needs to be doing and when. So building biology is kind of an exciting new frontier where how can we build our environments to better support kind of connections with nature. Things like biophilia. So kind of, it sounds funky, but essentially biophilia is bringing nature indoor, outdoor kind of ways that you can design your living environment. So that's kind of an element, but also you're looking at your air quality, your electromagnetic frequencies in your space. You're looking at kind of the light exposure that you're exposed to, how grounded the space is, all of these things that we can see and point to different studies that can impact your sleep results.
Not that this is surprising to you and this is something you already know, but I always love to just point out things that I find that people are really, really good at. Your nonverbals are incredible.
Really?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Oh, well, I appreciate that.
I literally, when you said, was biophilia?
Oh, yes.
When I said that word, I lifted one eyebrow and you caught that. You you totally caught the eyebrow lift of me going, what? I didn't have to say
a little intense.
I didn't have to say a word. And you're like, you knew exactly what I was thinking. That was.
Well, and it goes back to that hypervigilance. So many different people have these things for different reasons that they get interested in. So nonverbals, like I said, mine came about from like a fearful space of like, okay, something's wrong. The people in my environment, my immediate environment, like, oh, are they okay? Are they not okay? So the hypervigilance is from that kind of perspective. There's other people that have, they're coming from that from a place of just intrigue, curiosity. And I think mine has, I believe, married more into that world, we think, nowadays. But that was part of the original fuel. And so that's why it's like such an important thing for me. Now, you can skew into problematic sides of that. But I do think it's an interesting area for sure.
It's very Tony Robbins-esque, I feel like. It's kind of his story.
Total, yes,
yeah,
100%.
Growing up in just like a hyper volatile environment, so he had to like be very aware.
Yes,
and now he just does it for a living, so it's like this merging of both basically happening.
Yeah, well said.
So I have a round of rapid fire questions for you.
Okay,
it's whatever the first thing is that comes to mind. Okay, what's your best business advice?
How you do anything is how you do everything.
What's your favorite part about entrepreneurship?
Freedom.
What's your best marketing advice?
Authenticity.
When are you the most productive?
It's a good question. It used to be the opposite. So I do want to draw attention to this one. Real quick, many people I've found with sleep can have labels that can be problematic. I used to have the label of I'm an extreme night owl. I am the most productive at night when everyone else is sleeping, and I would create an environment to facilitate that. Turn on all the lights. It's like 2 a.m. Here I go, writing all the things, doing all the things. And all of my behaviors created an environment where that just kept happening for me night after night. I think there's an opportunity for people to examine any particular label that they might have about themselves as it relates to when they're most productive and not productive, and see, could we just try on new behaviors and habits, and over time could that become a whole new paradigm shift in when we're productive and when we're not. So what I mean by that is, now my new answer, after many, many years of embarking on more circadian aligned living, absolutely the mornings, which are my favorite time, which if I could go back in a time, kind of capsule or whatever, time machine, if I would have told myself that for many years ago, I would have been like, no way. And yet what is possible, and I'm not saying that there's not what is known as genetic drift, kind of a drift to certain lifestyles, and you might skew a little bit later, might skew a little bit earlier, but I think many of us have taken some of these habits that were not really designed to be in, like this indoor living that I pointed to, and running with it like I did. So what I would say is continue to be curious on particularly that question, which is a great one. But for me at this moment in time, it's absolutely the mornings.
I like that you explained all that. That's really interesting. Yeah, I think so often people just are like, yeah, I'm a night owl. And that's just an excuse to just be up late and binge or whatever.
Sure. And one of the things that we do find is, yes, there is a certain measurable kind of genetic differences in different people, and we might have some of those tendencies, but a couple things about that. More and more is coming out around some of those time givers that I mentioned that seem to entrain. So everything I do is around circadian rhythm entrainment. So you're entraining your body to wake up at a particular time, going to bed at a particular time. Same thing happens when you travel, dealing with jet lag. It would be really problematic if we could not adjust these things, but we can. So we find that if we go to, from New York to Hong Kong, you're kind of messed up in the first couple of days, but in a little bit of time, you start to entrain based on your environment. So we can entrain ourselves into different behaviors. Different stages of life will bring about very clear differences. Teenagers tend to skew a little bit later. So you have a dynamic shift that will occur throughout the course of your life, but just continuing to get curious on, are some of your habits pushing you or pulling you earlier or later, and what you could do to kind of explore that more.
This is going to make me sound like the lamest person of all time, but it's one of the reasons I don't like traveling, is because I don't like throwing off that skew of my rhythm.
I know, same, 100%.
I do like traveling, but I don't as much as I do because I hate throwing off that rhythm, honestly.
Rhythm, yes. I do recommend Time Shifter, the app, for anyone that has especially long haul travel. Really, really helpful. They use the same algorithm that they use at NASA to keep their astronauts on time, and super important for them. They really care deeply about maintaining a strong circadian rhythm, because when you're shuttling through space, the sun is rising and setting every 90 minutes or so. So it becomes very important for them to have a really strict and clear circadian aligned schedule. So they use that same algorithm for your trip to, Australia, and you put in your flight itinerary, and then it will pop out things that you can be doing in days in advance, the period of your trip, and then thereafter.
What?
Yeah, super helpful.
Okay, that's awesome. I have a new rapid fire question that I've never asked anybody. It feels fitting to you.
Yes.
What do you say to somebody that says, I only need 6 hours of sleep?
Oh, good question. Okay, so I'd say a couple things. Our generalized recommendations are for healthy adults, 7 to 9 hours is what we suggest for people. Now, there are differences in different individuals, and some people, almost the same way you have kind of different levels of hunger for certain foods, you might have different sleep hunger at different periods of your life. Given some of your behaviors, you're training for a marathon, you might require a little bit more sleep. If there's a lot of stress load, someone just passed away in your family or what have you, often we augment or subtract some of our sleep in periods of time at different points in our life. So you want to be looking at those dynamic changes. However, what I would say is in studies, we found a U-shaped curve where this U-shaped curve, when you get further away from kind of that 7 to 9 hour kind of curvature, then problems start to happen on both sides. So too much sleep, kind of hypersomnia, can be problematic as well. So we want to look at what's going on there. Is a poor quality sleep? Is something at play? Could there be narcolepsy? Or what's going on there? Sleep apnea. There's over 80 sleep pathologies or sleep disorders that are meet diagnostic criteria. So you want to make sure you're not dealing with any of those. Something like respiratory-based sleep difficulties are very, very rampant. You mentioned mouth taping, very helpful for many people. And the only call out is if people have undiagnosed sleep apnea, then they can be kind of putting a Band-Aid, no pun intended, on a very big problem. So, and we see tons of people running around with things like sleep apnea, upper airway resistance syndrome, which is kind of an in-between of sleep apnea. So I'm saying all that because we want to start to understand the quality of that sleep, the timing of that sleep. So some people, like I've had certain clients that they say, oh, I always get 8 hours. But then we look at, and maybe they do, but we look at their sleep and it's all over the place. They're going to bed at different times and, kind of making that happen in very odd ways. So we want to make sure that we're kind of hitting all of the pillars of great sleep around regularity, quality, consistency, all of these really important elements. So the 6-hour piece. Now, I will say as we get older, there is a tendency where we'll see people go down a bit in sleep duration, theories around reductions in melatonin production, different kind of approaches as to the why for that. But that is a common thing that as we get older, that tends to happen more frequently. So I would explore that piece. But I think one of the places to begin to understand how much sleep you need, I think wearables can be really helpful in this game. We're already in a very electronically focused, environment it's veering off of how we would have lived naturally. So since Pandora's box is open, let's have some of our technology help support us and understanding that quality of the sleep. So we can start to see things like, are there red flags existing in your sleep? So I know you were saying it sounds like really intuitive and sounds like a lot of your sleep is working. So some people might also not be tracking. And if they're considering tracking curious, some of the things that can come out are certain red flags, like if we see a lot of sleep fragmentation throughout the course of your night, that could be indicative of, kind of breathing disturbances, the sleep apnea, upper air resistance syndrome, and otherwise. Or is your heart rate very high throughout the course of the night? Is your HRV low? Is there kind of a nervous system regulation disruption? So there's a lot of things that we can pull out from that information that goes and feeds and gives us more kind of context for that total sleep number.
If somebody doesn't want to do a wearable, is there any apps you recommend that somebody could use to track some of this stuff?
Yeah, totally. So if they don't want to do a wearable, so years back, if you went into, if you were looking to get support with your sleep, some of the recommendation would be to keep a sleep diary or sleep log. So you could literally just have like pen and paper. That can be one step that you could do. So it's as low tech as you want. It's kind of analog journaling. And then on the other side of it, you can get different apps. Sleep Cycle is one. Another free one is Snore Lab that I would suggest for people that are curious if they might have some sort of sleep apnea, or if anytime you've been reported snoring, definitely check out on an app like this because it will record the audible noises that are coming out from you throughout the course of your night, give you kind of a grade. And if it's on the higher side of things, then it can be worth getting tested for sleep apnea. So none of these are diagnostic, but they can be helpful for sounding the alarms that something might be worth getting tested for.
All right. So another question for you. Tell me one secret about you or something that most people don't know about you.
I would say, this is a good one. Oh, I hate games.
All games.
Just all games.
Board, paper, card.
I'm really working on it, actually. It's like an area that I'm actually looking to have a breakthrough on if anyone has any suggestions. Something traumatic must have happened to me with like Uno or something. But I really, it's some sort of like
Cards Against Humanity, all of them.
All of them.
Right.
Yep. Some sort of thing. It's like it must be my perfectionistic tendencies, some sort of like performance anxiety, overthinking the rules. Wait, what is the rule again? When do you roll the dice? What do you do? all of it. So that's an area that I'm actually looking to. So if we ever meet and we're playing a game, I've had a breakthrough, hopefully, or I'm just dying a little inside.
Sports are okay though, just games.
I like sport. I like more of. I always trended towards solo-esque sports.
Same.
And maybe this same.
Yeah,
okay.
like golf, billiards.
Yeah, totally. I did
Yeah.
skiing a lot. You know, I was from Maine, so there wasn't a lot else to do there. Yes, so that I could kind of do my own thing, and brings it back to entrepreneurship and freedom and all of that. So.
And I'm very competitive with myself. I'm not super competitive with other people.
same.
I can be, but not nearly as much as I am with myself.
I'm exactly like that. Yeah,
For sure.
100%.
It's kind of why I recently signed up to do the High Rocks. That's purely a personal challenge for me.
Oh, I love
But,
that.
When were you the happiest?
I think now.
Sweet. What's your favorite part about Austin? And you can't say the people.
Ooh, nature. And so the nature, the ability to be out in the sun, the temperature, the ability to have walk and talks is my favorite thing on the planet, is to meet up with people and just, grab some coffee or whatever and just do a long walk and talk, kind of like this conversation, but walking.
I would say almost all of my meetings, as much as possible now, are walking or even like on the phone. Like I just headphones and I'll go on a walk.
Same.
Almost every time.
It's the best.
As much as I can. Sometimes you have to do FaceTime, but if I can avoid it, I will.
I do the exact same. Yep.
Love that. So I have one final question. Before I ask that question, though, I just want to acknowledge you for continuing to follow this insane, unique journey from Maine to New York to Croatia and all the other places overseas, and following entrepreneurship and finding yourself in a dark spot that has led you to a beautiful spot in terms of helping people with sleep and helping a lot of people, I'm sure, get their life back, because it's such an important part of our life. And there's no question that I enjoy spending time with you. So I just want to acknowledge all that.
Oh, I love that. Well, thank you. And I feel the feeling is mutual, feeling the love. No, 100%. You bring such just fantastic energy, and to take the time to really, and clearly these are such thoughtful questions, and I've always knew this about you even before this podcast, but just, really there's an intentionality about you that I think is rare, and it facilitates great conversations like this one. So
thanks.
Appreciate it.
Appreciate that. Acknowledged. So before I ask my last question, though, what's your plug? Where can people find you?
Sleepisaskill.com. You can do all kinds of things. So it kind of acts as a bucket for a lot of steps. So you can take a sleep assessment. So you can put in just, what's going on with your sleep. It will send you back kind of tailored things that you can do immediately. It also signs you up for our weekly newsletter. So another consistency thing. I love counting streaks. And so now I'm at, I don't know what I'm at, 250 or so newsletters. So those go out every Monday. Never miss a Monday. And our aim is to make it the most obsessive sleep newsletter on the planet. It's called Sleep Obsessions. So put different kind of like wearable data or sleep studies or things that are happening in the world of sleep to help facilitate people being in this conversation. Hopefully have fun. We really want to kind of gamify sleep and, see, look at it newly. And we have our weekly podcast, which we just recently moved to 2 episodes a week. This is very new. So we'll see how this goes. Yeah, right? Wish me luck. Yay, AI, for helping run certain pieces of this. But so that's, comes out every single week. And then if people are really still struggling, we do have the cohorts. We require that everyone wears an Oura ring to participate in all of those, to kind of have another, what we call the observer effect, or the Hawthorne effect, which is kind of this piece out of psychology where if you know you're being observed, you tend to act a little differently. So kind of leveraging that in a group dynamic setting. So bringing about, if we're all in a group and you're sharing about your meal timing piece, it's likely if you shared about that publicly and we're all going to look at your stats, you're probably going to adjust your meal behavior, right?
I already feel that from this podcast show since talking about it. People are going to ping me. There's no question.
Fantastic. I love it. Yes. Thank you for social support. Exactly.
Well, I acknowledge everything you just said because you're great, and I highly recommend people check you out. And so last question. It's really whatever your best piece of advice is. And so let's say you were to start over from ground zero of Sleep as a Skill, and you were talking to the early version of Mollie, just getting into this business of like trying to help coach and teach people on sleeping and all the things that come with it from a business and life standpoint. What's maybe the best piece of advice you would give to younger Mollie in that situation?
So one of the things that I think is kind of unique look at what it takes to be great at anything. And, I think all of us, I hope, are on this journey to continue to aim for that, right? One book that I really love, it's pulling from this quote from Steve Martin, "Be so good they can't ignore you." And I think that really speaks to a different angle than maybe has come about, and even maybe a little different from some of the things I shared, maybe it kind of contradicts some of the things I shared. The reason I say that is this book looks at, yes, of course, going towards what's joyful for you and gravitating towards that, but also knowing that with anything you do, you're going to have to, do the proverbial dishes, and there's going to be the not so fun things. And yet true kind of masters of their craft just, keep putting in the reps. Like you said, with the consistency, they keep showing up, the discipline, the great comedians that they work on the joke every single day and they just don't quit even when they're not in the mood and don't want to. And out of that process, then they just, time goes by and that compounding effect, and suddenly they're like amazing. I mean, my story is pretty weird and circuitous, and I could never have predicted that I would be in this place. And I think there could be arguments against, pursuing what I ended up pursuing. But I think from that place of being so good they can't ignore you, where you just keep going, keep trudging along, keep learning, and on the other side of it, suddenly you're making a difference.
Great advice. And I think you embody that in so many ways.
Right back at you.
So thanks for being on the show. Appreciate it.
Oh, thank you so much.
Hey friend, thanks for listening to the show. And if you have any feedback for me about the show or any other guests that you'd want to see in the show, definitely shoot me a message. I love engaging with my audience and figuring out how I can provide the best value possible to the people listening to this show. Before you go, I only have one ask of you, and that would be to check out my 3 Tips Tuesday newsletter. It's 3 marketing tips every Tuesday specifically for the health and fitness entrepreneur to help them attract new leads. If you press the link in the description, it'll take you directly to the archive of all my previous newsletters, and you can decide for yourself if it's something for you. If you end up finding it helpful, you can just sign up for the newsletter and you'll get it in your inbox every Tuesday. Thanks again, and keep hustling, my friends.